and thank you for joining us today for Energea's Charging Ahead webinar series. Today, we'll be talking about how to optimize behind the meter rates and incentives, a topic of increasing interest and importance across the US and overseas. My name is Ezra Beeman. I'm Managing Director of Energea. We are a boutique consultancy with offices in California and Sydney, Australia. My background is that I was a former rates strategy manager for Ausgrid, which was the largest transmission and distribution utility in Australia. And I've also previously worked for Cambridge Energy Research Associates in the Bay Area and in Paris, France. So today's topics will cover the US rate design requirements and guidelines, as well as Economics 101 to inform the discussion around what best practice rate and incentive design looks like. And then we'll look at a real world case study that we were part of in Australia, where we tested a very large number of different rate designs to better understand the impacts that they would be expected to have on consumer behavior, and principally what kind of DER gets adopted, what is its sizing, and what is its configuration, and how might it operate. And then we'll finish with a set of recommendations. Now, I'm joined by Sarah Gonzalez, who will be helping me manage and steward questions. There is a Q&A period at the end of the presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's questions, and you're welcome to put those questions into the chat at any time. And then finally, please don't forget to vote on your preferred topics for the future. I look forward to getting that feedback. Now let's get started. So I wanted to first start actually by US and California policies. California was selected just because we're based here, but I also wanted to highlight the difference between federal guidance and state regulations. Most rates are regulated by public utilities commissions, certainly of independent of investor-owned utilities. Munis are governed in a slightly different way. So first, I thought it would be worth walking through the history of utility rate design. This table is largely courtesy of Brattle, but we've added some new developments at the bottom. You can see here back in 1882, Thomas Edison designed a utility rate to compete with gas lighting, and it wasn't cost reflective as such. And I think the key quote at that period was that electricity was going to be too cheap to meter. Well, that hasn't really turned out to be the case. From there, we went to the Hopkinson two-part rate, where the second part was based on connected kilowatt demand, which then was modified to be actual maximum demand under Wright. And then ultimately, Houthacker went to a coincident system peak, which is what we generally use today. Other enhancements or innovations included conceptualization of real-time pricing, which we haven't seen a lot of other than in wholesale power markets, but it's something that we're seeing come up more often, even for infrastructure pricing for poles and wires, as part of real-time systems integrated with flexible resources. From there, we have innovations in California, for example, where they adopted an inclining rate, and that was to encourage energy efficiency. And it meant that as you used more, you would pay a higher charge. Congress got into the act in '78 with PURPA and had a number of requirements, but those actually only fell on the state regulators who could choose to implement them or not. And then finally, we see California um, moved to a 5-tier inclining block that wasn't related to cost per se, and also implemented a freeze on the first 2 tiers, which meant that the other tiers had to absorb more of those costs, and that has become somewhat unsustainable. In the last couple of years, I think California has received a lot of attention as well, as it moved away from NEM 2.0 to NEM 3.0, which reduces the incentives for behind the meter DER adoption. And then most recently in 2024, where a 2-part tariff with a fixed charge a significantly increased fixed charge is applied to customers' monthly bills with a lower volumetric rate, and that's really to encourage electrification of transport and building. So, in summary, there's been largely a theoretical set of innovations in the first 1800s and 1900s, followed by probably fair to say more political interventions to try and use rates to achieve policy ambitions. So, with respect to specific governing law, and I'm sorry this is maybe smaller than I would ideally like it to be, but under federal legislation, under that PURPA Act, they have some key guidelines for how rates should be designed. Um, some are around declining block rates. That's not no longer okay, even though there are some economic arguments as to why incremental costs may be lower than initial costs. The time of day rates. Um, and that those should be applied to different classes at different times of the day in a way that's cost reflective, that they might be seasonally varying, and that ultimately uh, uh, metering is required to support them. Now, what I found interesting under this particular element of the regulations is that it was really focused on wholesale, which is appropriate in the sense that the FERC and the feds govern the wholesale markets, um, but over here it isn't so explicit. Um, and I think one of the key questions is when you're bringing a retail rate together, how does the infrastructure get priced? What would be appropriate? And we'll talk about that in the rest of the presentation. The other thing I wanted to call out here is that in the federal legislation, there still is language around promoting energy efficiency. It hasn't moved to electrification encouragement, but it does recognize it is one of the goals of rate design, and that there are other objectives. So turning to California, California, the rules for investor-owned utilities are really set out under the state, um, I think the state constitution actually, that enables the CPUC to govern rates. The CPUC states that their rate design criteria includes encouraging conservation, electrification, and efficient use, affordability, and equity. The code itself is very high level, and we've called out a couple of key elements of that. Uh, rates shall be just and reasonable. Generally, this is more around cost allocation than the design itself, um, and that the commission will review each proposal on a case-by-case basis and determine whether or not it's justified. That utilities shouldn't be charging less than the marginal cost, although this is a particular section that um, focuses on irrigation, competition with irrigation districts. And then under 747A, that we have specific mention of time of use rates, including critical peak pricing and real-time pricing. They do talk about and here under section 747C 3, that time periods are appropriate for at least the following 5 years. So in summary, the PUC code sets out that rates should be just and reasonable. They should be cost reflective, but there's no further guidance as to what that means precisely. Is that just at the class level overall, or is it at the component level as well? I would lean towards component level, but I'm not a lawyer and certainly not familiar with a specific case law on this particular topic. Um, in terms of what an appropriate time period, again, more specificity would be helpful. Um, and my own sort of suggestion here is that it reflect significantly different forward-looking cost structures, right? So if you're on an off-peak period, that tends to be a lower cost. If you're in a peak period, it's a higher cost, and that those should be set roughly aligned to their incurring usage during those periods, incurring significantly higher or different costs. But during the Q&A, I'm keen to get anybody's view here as to the specific interpretations of these elements of rate design, because they are important in how things uh, are developed, and particularly they're important when you've got energy management systems, battery algorithms, artificial intelligence that is going to be optimizing rate designs to the third decimal place, which has never been the case before. Now, in addition to state and federal regulations that often fall on experts like myself in terms of whether or not it is a reasonable rate design and it is appropriate. Now, one of the canons of rate design, the Bombite principles, you can see the cover here. Um, but in summary, and these were developed in 1961, James Bombright set out the following key attributes of sound rate structure. So simple, understandable, feasible to implement. I think increasingly the simplicity and the understandability should have renewed focus, because what is simple and understandable to orphans and widows, shall we say, is very different to what's understandable to expert systems and artificial intelligence, which is increasingly what's determining when a vehicle charges, when a battery operates, etc. Uh, Obviously, it needs to yield the total revenue requirement. Otherwise, it's not really doing its job as a rate. It needs to be stable. Now, to the extent that a particular rate is can be gamed, I think that's one of the unsustainable elements of a rate design. So part of what makes for a sustainable tariff is that it's cost reflective, and that those costs are accurately specified, and that they're recovered in an in an appropriate way via time differentiated prices. Costs need to be apportioned fairly among the different customers, and so customers that use more at a more expensive time should pay more than those that use at lower cost times. So here, the cost reflectivity of the rate, marginal revenue equal marginal cost, and I'll get into what that means in a second, ensures cost causation recovery. Should avoid unfair discrimination of cross subsidization or cross subsidization between customer groups. And again, cost reflectivity, if marginal cost and marginal revenue are aligned, avoids that cross subsidization. I'll get into a worked example in a second. And then finally, it should discourage wasteful usage while promoting efficient and justified levels of consumption. And again, cost reflectivity is the panacea that will deliver all these outcomes. So it sounds like, if you believe these dot points, that really it's important to make sure you've got cost reflective rate designs. Now, finally, I wanted to just highlight that there is a National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, guidelines around how rate design should be implemented. They released their rates manual for distributed energy resources. And that contains specific guidance around, well, how do you factor in incentives for distributed energy resources? And a lot of the same language, because again, it falls on economic principles, apply whether or not it's for consumption or potentially for supply. That is cost of service. They should reflect the actual cost of service. And for distributed energy resources, they can drive additional costs around voltage compensation, phase balancing, and other issues. And the additional systems required to integrate these resources also cost money. Things like DERMS, or distributed energy research management systems, are not free. Again, they should be fair, equitable, efficient, and transparent. Something I would mention here in Australia that has over 50% of penetration of rooftop PV in single-family dwellings. They're starting to implement export charges to recover some of those specific costs of distributed energy. So let's talk about economics 101, which really is the underpinning um, theory guiding a lot of the recommendations and regulations. So previously, some of the language talked about efficiency. Now, there are three main types of efficiency. There's productive, there's allocative, and dynamic. Pricing plays a role in all three of those types of economic efficiency. In the case of productive efficiency, this is really about trying to find the lowest input factors to achieve a certain outcome. This case, we're putting in the mix of bulk resources and behind the meter resources. And depending on what the mix, each of those factors costs, you can get a different cost point. And um, productive efficiency is achieved when you have found through the economy a least cost way of delivering the service. So In this case, you could have a lot more bulk resources and fewer behind the meter. Here, you've got a lot more behind the meter versus bulk resources, and we don't know for sure. It would take a lot of work to figure out what the appropriate mix is. But to achieve productive efficiency, one of the key things that has to occur is that you have to have allocative efficiency. If you do not know what the price of bulk resources are or the price of behind the meter resources, the economy cannot find that most efficient equilibrium. So it is, fundamental to this is ensuring that prices are correct and that prices are correct based on correct understanding of costs. So let's turn to allocative efficiency. Now, apologies for everybody who fell asleep in economics class. We're almost through this. Um, One of the key principles of economics and of allocative efficiency is that marginal revenue needs to equal marginal cost under an efficient system. Now, competition is the way you achieve this. If somebody were to increase the cost of their supply above economic levels, they get competed out of that market by others entering and providing a lower cost. It's a bit more of a challenge in regulated economies because if you have no choice and the supply is increased above efficient levels, you have to pay it, or you've had to pay it heretofore. One of the key opportunities moving forward for consumers, electricity consumers, is that they can, if they are have the means, invest in rooftop solar and battery storage, and therefore substitute um, their purchasing of electricity for purchasing of rooftop solar and storage, and increasingly electric vehicles. You can go drive over to the next utility or where you work and maybe charge up there and bring it home and put it back in your house. So while currently electricity rates need to reflect marginal cost, um, in the future we expect that you're going to see a lot more competition temporary or provided by the ability to substitute. Um, so the other key principle here is one of, well, actually, let's go through the worked example first. So what happens if we don't have marginal cost equals to marginal revenue and price, i.e. that um, your consumption or reduction in consumption doesn't reduces your bill more or less than the actual reduction in cost to serve you. So here we have a customer cost to serve, just conceptual. Now in many rate designs, the actual, for example, the NEM 2.0, it could reduce your bill by significantly more than you actually reduce the cost of service. And over the long run, I should always say over the long run. Um, and so what was remained is a cross subsidy under a regulated system. This lack of cost recovery means that somebody else is going to have to pay, and that's generally not legal under a host of regulations, and it's not good economic policy as well. So ultimately, what the economists will tell you is that if you have a rate design that is cost reflective and somebody reduces their consumption, that the reduction in their bill will only reflect the long run marginal cost avoided. Another really important principle that hasn't actually mattered in electricity until very recently is price elasticity of demand. And what that means is the reduction in demand given a change in price. And you can apply this to anything, but in electricity, it hasn't really mattered because in the short term, if prices go to 2 orders of magnitude higher, people are generally not going to change their behavior. I don't know about 2 orders of magnitude, but um, electricity is generally considered to be price inelastic, and that is largely because it's been too costly to store. Now, as the price of storage falls dramatically, that's all going to change. And also because people can buy rooftop PV, they can also drive in their energy. All of a sudden, this industry is facing a much more elastic future. And again, it is therefore much more important that prices are set correctly, or we're going to get uneconomic substitution, uneconomic defection, and that ultimately is not going to be good for the community. So, how do you deal with rising flexibility and demand? Well, one of the folks who has spoken to this particular issue is Ramsey. Um, so given emerging DER is able to significantly reduce consumption and using battery storage able to be highly flexible, how should residual costs be allocated? Now, let me first speak to residual costs. So long run marginal costs are forward looking costs that are able to be avoided in the long run. And the long run is defined as any the time over which all costs are variable. And yet there may be more costs to recover because historically there could be sunk costs, there could be a change in cost structure, and under regulated systems, investors are enabled to earn recover their costs for basically prudent and efficient investments. So there can be what's called residual costs, and the question is how best to recover them, and which sort of methods or allocation methods should be used. So Frank Ramsey proposed Ramsey pricing in 1927. It was really around taxation, but it has been applied in electricity as well. And he basically put forward a theory that charging higher prices to groups with less elastic demand is the best way to recover those costs. Um, so one of the key issues here for electricity rate design is that those with less elastic demand, yes, it includes wealthy households. I've seen research that if you're really wealthy, you're quite you don't really do much in response to price increases. However, there is a confounding variable in that folks that are wealthier, they tend to own their own homes, they tend to be in single family dwellings, and these are the types of premises that are most able to adopt rooftop solar PV, battery storage, etc. And therefore, if they're below the level of being not caring about their electricity bill, but being able to afford it, which is probably middle class to upper middle class, I'm going to guess, then you've got an issue of not recovering residual costs from these folks and having them pay their fair share can be problematic for equity reasons, and you can't necessarily have it fall just on the very wealthy or on the disadvantaged segments of our population. So how best to deal with that? And I think that's an open question for the time being. Uh, Moving to fixed costs that don't vary by your usage is one way of doing it. Ultimately, though, that could encourage folks to become independent, move on to microgrids, and then maybe we'll have to consider exit fees. So it's a vexing question. It's not yet resolved, even in places like Australia, where you have a significant amount of adoption. They haven't got to the level yet that they're really considering how this is going to play out. So now let's talk about best practice, rate practice. The first thing is appropriate period classification. Now, what we have here is looking at raw historical numbers. Now, this is by month. I think that's March, August, September, October, and then you've got time of day, from midnight to midnight. And this is showing the percentage of substations that peak at a certain time. And the stuff in red is above 90%, and the stuff in yellow is above like 10%. So you can see that the peaking behavior varies over time and by season. Now, what's interesting is that the time of use periods in this particular jurisdiction are very flat, so it's stable, and only covering some of the periods, not covering all of them. Um, and uh, so that's problematic. Is this appropriate? I don't really think so. Other things that we tend to do when we're looking at period classification is um, weather normalization. It might have been a really hot year, and so you have to correct for the weather normalization. The other thing that we believe needs to be corrected for is future what are future prices likely to look like, and that's where you take into account underlying drivers of peak demand. And once you do that, it can give you a more reasonable time when the peak period actually occurs. And this is when we think prices should be set in terms of peak versus off peak. Now, when we benchmark this, and I'm not going to go into the detail here, this is in Australia. I'd love to do this in the States, given the opportunity. But what we basically found was a huge amount of variation in what was defined as the peak period, um, whether it was weather normalized, whether it was forecasted, which was very uncommon. But the definitions, I'll leave you here to read them in the deck that we'll send out, were very varied, and very few of them actually were aligned to the process I just shared with you. Now, the other issue is the setting of long run marginal cost. When we did an estimate of this in Australia, we found that on average, our analysis of long run marginal cost was double or triple that of what is being published. Having been a rates manager, I understand the thinking, and I also understand the concern that if you send out a signal that's too high, you're going to potentially get folks to invest in more batteries, and that could be bad for the future of your system. But going back to allocative, productive efficiency, if you do not set these prices in a cost reflective way, this system, your consumers, your prosumers, et cetera, are not going to make their efficient levels of investment. And ultimately, you're going to have a higher cost system over time. The other thing, if you look at the definition of long run, it's the period over which all costs are variable. It doesn't care that that substation is got a 50-year lifetime. You've got to put that cash flow 50 years in the future and discount it to present, but all those costs need to be factored in. And our experience is that that would significantly increase the amount of cost to be recovered in the peak period. And by shortening that peak period to what is truly peak, you'll get a much higher a price. Doesn't have to be what you make default, but certainly the robots and the storage resources are going to be able to start to bring your cost structure down by only um, leaving residual demand where it's cost effective. In terms of how long run marginal cost has been defined, again, in Australia, all kinds of variation. I think this is probably the case in the US as well. How much of replacement expenditure versus augmentation versus connection is included in LRMC varies wildly. Now, I think as a policy and regulatory practice, it would be good to get more consistency, but just generally to make sure that your long run marginal cost is done in an economically efficient way is going to be so much more important when people have storage and they have flexible loads like vehicles, so that you don't find yourself in a higher cost structure and ultimately more defection than you should see. I won't touch on the longer marginal cost of DER. Suffice it to say that they have their own costs and that those should be reflected in their structure. In terms of the rate design options, there's actually quite a few of them. Whether it's subscription, you use a maximum, you might have an averaging, whether you're charging on kilowatt hours, kVA, or kilowatts. So there's a whole universe of different methods that can be used as rate design. How do we know what decisions around here mean in terms of how it's going to drive customer behavior? Um, this slide is really speaking to uh, when there are issues around cost reflectivity, like for example, customer savings is too high for utility savings. In the case of a flat tariff, there's no reason to buy storage. That you can actually design the rate to recover. Sorry, design the incentive to recover or to provide to correct the tariff signal, and that's something that we've seen successfully deployed in California. So let me just finish with the best practice case study, noticing that we're at time. Apologies for going over a little bit. Hopefully folks can stay a few minutes and participate in the Q&A. But here what we did is we had a number of different peak mechanisms, monthly maximum demand, yearly maximum demand, and a number of residual cost recovery mechanisms. And then we defined them here. And we used our utility simulator software, which models customer behavior, to estimate what the impact of these different structures is on adoption of DER and the configuration of that DER. And what we found was, and sorry, just to define community costs, it's the retail cost plus the T&D cost. So this is commodity costs, T&D costs, and then the cost of the distributed generation. That's the total community costs. What we found, so this is monthly maximum demand versus average of top 5 versus average demand versus average of top 5 variant 2. And then these are the residual cost recovery mechanisms that some resulted in significantly higher. So there was a base level of DER here. Some resulted in significantly higher DER adoption because of the increase in the payback periods, for example. They had very different configurations. Like even though they had both high DER here, this one resulted in almost 100% storage. This one resulted in almost 100% PV. So it's important, and this was a great case study to highlight that the rate structure matters a lot in terms of what people are going to be doing. When we rolled that into, for example, the bill savings versus the avoided network costs. The more cost reflective ones were more aligned. Overall, it would have an impact on average rate increases, and ultimately, you're looking for community costs and cross subsidies. That the one that was most efficient had the lowest overall community costs relative to the baseline, and had also the lowest cross subsidy. So any of these we felt would fall into a good rate design, and things like seasonal time of use and just business as usual flat had a much higher community cost, mostly because of overconsumption in solar and much higher cross subsidies. All right, so key takeaways and recommendations. Rates and incentives are primary driver of DER adoption and operation. Virtually all rates and incentives do not reflect key economic principles at the time at the moment, resulting in inefficient adoption and operation. Key reforms needed include unbundling, locational accurate long-run marginal cost and period calculation, and a fair and efficient residual cost allocation. Uh, Efficient rates and incentives will deliver 2 to 3 times more DER in the right places and at the right times in the right mix. And the reform does not necessarily need to increase costs for disadvantaged or undermine efficient network investment or operation when it's done well. So some regulatory changes are probably needed, and real-time pricing is nice to have, but 90% of the benefits we estimate will come from unbundling, improving cost and period accuracy. So I'll leave you here with this message at the bottom. A lot of folks know E equals MC squared. Other folks may be familiar with the second law of thermodynamics. Both of these are taken very seriously. Um, uh, I think it's probably fair to say that most folks are not taking marginal revenues equal marginal costs quite as seriously, but in economics, I would say they are probably just as important. All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope you got something out of that, and I look forward to your questions and seeing you hopefully at our next webinar. All right, first question. As an individual customer, I may be able to optimize battery charging given current tariffs. However, at some point, many others may adopt similar behavior, at which point would not the optimized charging pattern change or gains diminish over time? Absolutely. One of the most interesting things that we've seen in our analysis is as more and more demand becomes flexible, the peak periods shift around a lot, and you ultimately get to an anytime peak demand charge to get the most efficient outcome, which is an increase in what they call load factors, right? Which is pretty much a flat usage profile. Although that's great for infrastructure, it's actually not great for renewable energy. And so you have these two forces in competition where renewable energy wants you to move around with the renewables and infrastructure wants you to move around within the renewables but never go above a certain limit. And I think those are the two tensions that we will be seeing play out, and a key question is what pricing system is going to get us there. Cost reflectivity is the initial answer. With respect to rates, can you elaborate on what is meant by unbundling? Okay, so appreciate this question. Right now, pretty much everybody understands that consumers that only use the transmission system shouldn't pay for the distribution system, right? It just goes without saying. However, what's less understood is that folks that are using behind the meter resources, let's say from their next door neighbor, and it's not at a period where they're backfeeding the exports to say other customers at higher voltage levels. Why would that electricity be charged for the subtransmission and the transmission system? It's not needed, and isn't used. And I know there's all kinds of counter arguments around Kirchhoff's law and how electricity really flows. Um, but fundamentally, if you're not backfeeding, uh, uh,
Yeah. Thank you very much for attending today. If you have any additional questions, please send it to us via email, and I'll do our best to respond. Have a nice day.